You set as a goal that Ontario should offer the best public services delivered most effectively in the world. Reasonable?
I think so. It came to me in a moment. It wasn't something I had premeditated. It was during an interview with Steve Paikin on the agenda, and he and some of the other guests were kind of giving me a hard time for being relatively lofty in my objectives for the public services in Ontario. And as I was thinking about it, I originally thought about it from the inverse. What country or what entity in the world has a legitimate claim to be superior to Ontario public services? We have the highest percentage of people in Ontario with some form of post-secondary education. They're typically hired by governments. Almost everybody in the Ontario government has some degree of post-secondary education, much more so than any other entity. Why wouldn't that translate into the best services? And we have access into the knowledge of every other market in the country. So I guess by inverse, I think it's a reasonable proposition. Why would the United Kingdom, France, or Germany, or anybody else, or British Columbia have an advantage over Ontario? So hence, why wouldn't Ontario be number one?
The other reason I loved it was because it moved beyond the notion of simply doing this for fiscal reasons.
Right.
In other words, to set a target that is terrific in the context of public administration.
Well, another one I said without thinking about it too much at the time, but I think it's true as I reflect upon it. Of 366 recommendations, I think 365 of them should be implemented even if you were in a huge fiscal surplus. Because why would you want to be distrustful and wasteful of public taxpayers' money? The one I probably wouldn't have recommended if we had the fiscal money in Ontario would be the full-day kindergarten. Because unlike the marginal reduction in classroom size, there is some evidence that over the long run that does have some benefits, but it's over $1.5 billion. But all the other ones, even if you had the surplus, if you didn't need the money, you could run it efficiently and more money, then why not just give it back to the people in tax cuts?
You must have been encouraged by the April budget because it had a lot of your recommendations in it.
Well, I was even encouraged before that. And of course, some of them were implemented before the April budget. I thought the most important signs to me they were taking it greatly was they adopted the machinery of government changes. So first of all, they created a cabinet committee led by the Premier to review this exercise and do the implementation. That had been I always say in public policy, the great lament is they won't allow us as public policy people to conduct experiments. They're worried about ruining people's lives, and they're like with biologists or physicists, we can't have experiments. So you have to cherish the examples you've got. And all the examples of fiscal retrenchment that worked in Canada, the Roy Roman in Saskatchewan, Klein in Alberta, Harrison in Ontario, Martin in the federal government, were all led from the top. They were never delegated to some subcommittee led by some more junior minister.
Or more than one in public service.
Or delegated to public service. And we'd had, in fact, the very first thing the Ontario government gave me was all the Treasury Board submissions on this kind of exercise before I came on the scene. It was a 4-inch D-ring binder. I did not know they existed. It's that big. And it was full. And it was all just recycling the same thing. But they didn't have the authority to get it done. So the fact they created that internal machinery of government, and then they also, of course, they put in the Deputy Minister of Finance to be the Secretary of Cabinet, which me signaled, okay, they get it. Fiscal is going to dominate their life. Let's get the fiscal guy in there. And then it kind of bothered me at the time, but they took the head of my secretariat and put it as number 2 in support of the cabinet. And then right after the budget, they took 5 of the 7 people that had been on my secretariat and created an implementation team within the cabinet. So sometimes if you work in a government, some people go for the tangible stuff, what measures are taken, and I kind of look at the inside, because if you want to stall something, just make sure you've got an inefficient process and you guarantee it's not going to happen. So at least they created the possibilities with the internal machinery of government changes to do something.
Minister Duncan was stopped, as you know, when he tried to, in the omnibus budget bill, do some offloading.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a blip or as a showstopper? Do you think?
Well, I'm hoping that maybe it'll come back with a few changes, but I'm hoping it'll come back as a separate bill. It's a little bit on a smaller scale what's happening in the federal government with this absolutely immense omnibus bill. It's funny at the federal level. I don't think there's a single day I don't pick up a paper and find out there's something in the omnibus bill that I did not know was in the omnibus bill. So, and there was a lot put in the budget omnibus bill for the Ontario government. So hopefully it's not dead by any means, because I do think that is going to be a critical part of it. absolutely agnostic of whether the public services are delivered by a public body or a private body. I'm absolutely insistent that it is delivered by a private body and not be a race to the bottom solely whoever does it cheapest. It has to be on a quality basis. But my perspective to the unions, and I saw all of them, is that if you think you're competitive, because they would argue on a quality basis they could do a better job, I said that's great. And then you'll bid on a quality adjusted basis and the contract should all be established. I don't want some private entity checking my blood if they're not able to do a good job of it. So you've got to factor that into it.
This is a bit of a sidebar, but the whole omnibus budget bill tradition or process that seems to be starting, very alien to your experience, I guess. What do you think is behind this?
Well, actually it's not. As most things in life, it's just another step along the road.
Okay.
So when I was in finance, and keep in mind I was there from 77 to 2000, we were always pushing the envelope with the omnibus bill, but our lawyers were always insistent that there had to be a link in the budget. But sometimes you had to really be a insider to recognize the link. You know, for example, if you wanted to put something on a clean air bill in it, there could be a sentence to say, it's nice to wake up in the morning and look at the blue sky. And then, here become the legislation in the omnibus bill for a Clean Air Act, and somebody would say, what's that got to do with the budget? I said, didn't you see that sentence about the clear blue sky? I mean, it wasn't quite as bad as that, but it was almost as bad as that. So, and we were in the last number of years, so I would say in those liberal years from 93 to 2000, in fact, Justice counted it, the finance department was responsible for 40% of the entire legislation that went through the House of Commons, and almost all that went through on budget omnibus bill. So this is not a new, but I think this budget in particular has pushed it into a new realm.
It's all very well to talk about change because of the fiscal imperative, and I totally get it. The question, I guess, for me a little bit is, there is a role you could argue for government to invest in the future, to prepare for change. Are you confident that if the government were to move forward with your recommendations, that they can do both?
No, that's probably the biggest point of skepticism I have of the whole exercise. Governments are not, by the nature of their electoral cycle, in a position to think that far forward. And I recommend they do it, but I recognize no one's ever done it before, so what's likely the government to do it? In Ontario, you have fixed election cycles of 5 years now. At the provincial or municipal or federal level, you're always facing somewhere between a 2-year and a 5-year horizon. You're always facing some kind of election. It's just not a system where you can say, I'm going to incur some costs over the next 2 or 3 years with no tangible payoff, but it's going to have a huge payoff in this child's life in 20 years from now. And it would change your approach. If you said to me, my objective is to take $1 out of healthcare spending in 2030, I would put $1 into education for some vulnerable child right now, because that child is going to become very expensive for the healthcare system. Obviously not giving them a very pleasant life right now, but that doesn't do anything for you in the short term, and there's no payoff in political terms from that, not even necessarily in bureaucratic terms. So all public policy, whether it's the healthcare, social systems, or the justice system, is always based upon something going wrong and then doing your best job possible to fix it up after something's gone wrong. So if you look at healthcare, it's all patching up people after it's gone. We hardly do anything on the health promotion side. It's health care as opposed to just health. The justice system, if you look at a province like Ontario, others I'm sure are the same. Disproportionately, the people in our prisons in Ontario are people suffering from mental health difficulties. That's the last route that you want to do. They're not getting treated. You should be intervening early, but the system's just not designed to do that, because again, it has upfront costs and without immediately identifiable benefits in the short term. I certainly urge the Ontario government to think about that and crash through that, but it's always difficult when no one else has done it. We got a lot of countries around the world and no one's doing